The long-awaited presidential election is now over, and we know Donald Trump will be our 47th president, and he'll be supported with a Republican majority Senate and, as of today, quite possibly a Republican-controlled Congress. On this episode of FieldLink, we sit down with Government Affairs Director Sean McCarty to discuss how the recent election will impact the pending Farm Bill and other agriculture policies. Plus, Jody Lawrence joins us from Nashville to discuss the commodity markets and how the recent election results is already impacting global trade. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. Welcome back to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith, and joining us today in the FieldLink podcast studio is Sean McCarty. Sean is the Director of Government Affairs for Helena. Sean, welcome back to FieldLink.
No, it's a pleasure as always, Bill.
Sean, post-election, boy, this was a wild one, wasn't it? We've got a new president-elect, Donald Trump, who will be taking over the presidency in January.
Yeah, I think that there was obviously some surprises. I think that some things went how we thought they would, but I have a real question about what some of these pollsters and folks that are in that industry are going to do moving forward, because it seems like the last 3 or 4 elections, the projections have actually gotten further and further apart. Yeah. But that probably speaks more to polling methodology and how we get a pulse on the country. And that's changing, no different than Sure. the way we communicate from a media standpoint.
It definitely is changing. You listen to some of the sidelines talking about pollsters, the old days of picking up the phone, making calls. Who answers their phone anymore?
There's a very small percentage of the population. It's actually interesting when you break down the polls about who answers the phone, who answers a landline, or who answers a phone and decides I'm actually going to spend my time. And that's a very small percentage. And they tend to vote a certain way, and so that data set is almost completely skewed.
Yeah, definitely. And you could really peel that onion back, and different age demographics and economic demographics could be all over the board with those kind of surveys, I guess, if you will. Moving forward, wow. A whole new world. I think a big shocker when the results came in Tuesday night, but not just for the presidency. That was a big one. But boy, we had kind of a landslide or shift in the other areas of elections.
We did. I think when we spoke the last time a few months ago, and some of the conversations that we've had leading up to the election, if you want to say with certainty, and nothing is guaranteed, but we pretty much knew that Republicans would take back the Senate based on the seats that were open and the favorites and what much of the information from over the last 2 to 3 years said. We knew that Republicans would likely have at least 51 seats in the Senate. Turns out that it'll be 53. The House was where the real, if you want to say shock was, it was always going to be close. The belief was it would be a slim majority, probably for the Democrats, just because there were way more vulnerabilities on the Republican side. But as we can see with the popular vote and the disparity there on the presidential side, there was just a lot of folks that either chose to not vote or were upset with the past 4 years, and that stretched down ticket. And so it wasn't just the presidential side of things. It went all the way down to the House. And so here we are, a week past the election, and we're at 214, I think was the last check for Republicans. I think they were still leading in at least 8 races that had yet to been called, and all they need is 218. 218 gets the Republicans to the majority in the House, and so there's a very real likelihood that, Republicans end up having possibly a 220, 221, 222 seat position in the House. They've got a 3-seat majority in the Senate, and they've got the presidency. So it really could not have gone any better for Republicans.
Yeah, definitely the trifecta looks like it's going to be a trifecta, I guess, for the Republican Party this year.
Yeah, and at the state level, not too much changed. Michigan had a change within their legislature. Most of the states kind of remained how they were, and you had a couple shifts on the governor's side. But I think that the biggest shocks really did happen there in the House, and within the presidency, maybe just the fact that it wasn't that Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. He won both.
Yeah. Yeah, so that eliminated a lot of chatter about, oh, do we need to change our structure?
Recounts and stretching. I think there was a lot of belief that at this point we would still not know who the president was, that it would be very close and there would be arguments and potential lawsuits and recounts, and there may still be that in some of these very close House races.
Sure.
So declaring that the Republicans control the House may not actually be known for quite some time, but we do know who's going to be president, and we do know that Republicans are going to control the Senate, and that alone shifts policy in this country greatly from where we've been the last 4 years.
So I think that's a great segue to what I really want to try to talk about today is policy. What does this mean after the election results come in? And, in your crystal ball, Sean, you get to spend a lot of time in D.C. and in that circle and talk to lots of different folks at the state level as well. My biggest question is, what does this mean right now for the Farm Bill? A lot of our listeners are really hyper-focused on that because we've got some critical dates coming up here just after the first of the year. Got about 6, 8, 9 weeks or so left here before.
Yeah, we've talked about this repeatedly over the last 2 years. When the Farm Bill, this current version, expired back in 2023, about the challenges of letting it run into 2024 with the election coming up, and how it would likely not get passed just because of some of the uniqueness of trying to campaign with the Farm Bill out there. And the uncertainty behind who would gain the majorities. And we talked about waiting till after the lame duck and seeing what the makeup looked like. Would it be in both parties' interests to agree upon something? I think they've got maybe 16 working days where both chambers are in to get something done before the next Congress comes in. And if Republicans control the House, if Democrats believe that Republicans are going to control the House, that uncertainty doesn't help. Not having those elections called, not knowing yet who truly runs the House in the next Congress probably complicates it. However, I think Democrats know that they have lost their leverage, that Republicans on the House side, if they control it, are going to be able to write their own version of the Farm Bill. And as long as they can pass along party lines and they'll have a little bit of wiggle room, they can get their version through the House. It will still need to garner support from Democrats in the Senate to get it done.
Sure.
And the president would be likely to sign it, but they've lost their leverage. Right now they control, the Senate, so they had a little bit of a governor on it, but so the Republican version would not get very far. Now they've lost that. And so I do think that Democrats will probably make every attempt possible to try and pass a Farm Bill during this lame duck. I don't know what they're willing to give away. Nutrition, supplemental nutrition, the food stamp program is probably concern number one for them. Mm-hmm. They do not want to lose anything there, and it's going to be the lion's share of the Farm Bill funding anyway.
Sure. And I think that's an important point to our listeners. It is a lion's share. It's what, 70?
Oh, it'll be well over 80%.
Wow.
And so they're going to do everything they can to pass it because if they wait until the next Congress, Republicans write the House version, Republicans control the Senate and what gets through there, and it's Donald Trump's signature. And they may be forced into giving away even more. Mm. On the flip side, if you're the Republicans, why would you pass anything during the lame duck? Write your own, make the priorities what you want, pull the funding from things you don't like, and go forth. And while, yes, Democrats will need to vote in the Senate for it, they're going to need to get some things done, and they're going to be forced into passing it. So I do think we have a very interesting situation with regard to the Farm Bill. We need it passed. The uncertainty, if you look at what's being proposed right now, you've got the Farm Act, which has been proposed by Representative Trent Kelly from Mississippi, that would provide relief due to the depressed harvest and commodity prices in 2024. Congressman Valadao from out in California has proposed a disaster relief bill, upwards of $14 billion for farmers that experiences loss during the natural disasters that occurred. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to create these kind of quasi-farm bill support, financial support programs because we don't have anything new reflective of the current market.
Right. Like a master bill, if you will.
And so we may be able to get those attached to a disaster aid package. A disaster package is going to be passed. We may be able to get those attached, but that's short term, specific to 1 year. We need to get a farm bill passed. I think it will be a top priority. I think that 2025, if they don't get it passed in a lame duck, I think 2025 will be as hot and heavy for farm bill. I think you will see farm bill getting mentioned in the mainstream channels, as opposed to it usually kind of being kind of under the radar. It's not exciting. People aren't paying attention to that.
It usually falls right into the general ag media for sure.
Yeah.
We're talking about it a lot here, but I just driving in this morning on XM radio, I'm hearing it, Fox and CNN all talking about the farm bill right now, because really it is the one thing that actually might get done between now and January.
And that'll be, based on the priorities of the administration, how they view a lot of the money that goes into climate smart programs and stuff like that. Republicans have a view about taking that unspent money that was never really determined how to spend it and saying, hey, we have money. We have money here. So when they go through budget reconciliation and look at where the government is spending money, I think that's where you're going to see a really big shift in disagreements they had with the previous administration on where we were spending a lot of this money and redistributing it elsewhere. And I think ag stands to be a beneficiary.
Wow. Lots happening in that space. So just to clarify, need 60 votes, right?
In the Senate.
On the Senate. So based on the numbers at 53,
you're going to need seven.
Seven
you're going to need seven
senators.
Democrats. That's assuming that all your Republicans would vote for it.
Correct.
And there are ag states out there that have senators from the Democratic Party. Now, we lost a couple of them. John Tester in Montana, and that shifted to a Republican vote.
Sure.
I think as Democrats are still probably going through the grieving period and looking back and saying, how did this all go so wrong? I do think that they will probably be a little bit more willing to entertain, okay, how do we look at things a little bit differently from some of this on the voting stance? Maybe we need to support some of these initiatives to bring the Democratic Party maybe back closer to the center and support some of these things that obviously a number of people voted for. And so 60 is still going to be a pull, but if they want to get the overall package and the supplemental nutrition piece through, they're going to have to vote for it.
Right. Definitely a lot going to happen. A lot still happening here in the next several weeks as we find what the House finally settles out to and those numbers and so forth. But certainly a farm bill very critical to agriculture and really providing that sense of security for producers to know where their investments are at moving into 25.
Absolutely. We're in a challenging climate from a financial standpoint, and we need some level of certainty, whether that's financial certainty or regulatory certainty. But we've said it time and time again, farming's enough of a gamble every year. And so the more certainty we can get in these areas, the better. And so I do think we're moving in a positive direction there, but the sooner we can get the control and the chambers sorted out, the sooner we can get a farm bill passed. We understand the policy priorities of the political appointees and cabinet officials. We can really kind of start and move forward with this next phase of American agriculture in this administration.
Well, we're in that honeymoon period right now, Sean, where, we're getting spoon-fed nuggets, if you will. Hey, who is going to get this office and who's going to hold this area? What have you learned from your seat on the bus? Who's going to be taking over, for example, some critical places like the EPA?
Yeah, so we've seen that appointment come out. Lee Zeldin from Long Island up in New York ran for governor, did not win, but I think outperformed the expectations in a state like New York. And there are some shifting politics up there, but did really well. And I think the Trump administration has looked at him. He's a lawyer, also a Army Reserve veteran. And so I think while he doesn't have a whole lot of ag experience from a law and order standpoint, and he does have some environmental expertise, I think looking at appointees, there's an unknown, there's a lack of familiarity there, but no red flags to the industry, which is good. We don't have a USDA secretary out there. A lot of names have been floated. Some of those are what I would say not traditional ag. We've heard Thomas Massey's name floated out in some social media circles, congressman from Kentucky. But you've also got G.T. Thompson, who's the current House Ag Chair. He's been trying to write a farm bill for years now. He's been he's been a very good foot soldier for for Donald Trump and the Republican Party of trying to reach across the aisle and get things done in a traditionally bipartisan ag committee.
Pennsylvania native.
Pennsylvania,
right?
yep. Yeah. Ted McCinney, who is the current head of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, former director of ag in Indiana, actually came from our industry. There's a number of others. At one point, Kristi Noem, but word is getting out there that maybe she may have a role with Homeland Security. So there's a lot of names.
Sure.
It seems like many of those names are funneling out rapidly now. Under the previous administration of Trump, maybe because he was so new to it and not really sure, we did not have Sonny Perdue's name as Ag Secretary until the day before the inauguration.
Okay.
So it still could be some time, but with the Farm Bill hanging out there, my sense is he will try and get that person named so we can start going through the confirmation process. With 53 Republican senators, you only need a majority, a simple majority. So I think I've not seen anybody yet that strikes me as a controversial one that wouldn't be able to get through the confirmation process. But we do have a ways to go. But the sooner we can get a USDA secretary in there, the better for our industry. And the industry's working hard to kind of talk to all the potential folks in there and make sure they understand the priorities.
Yeah, and I think it's important for our listeners to know, to go back in our civics lesson, once somebody's appointed, they do have to go through confirmation, and it's a majority by just the Senate, correct?
Yes. So, 50, and we saw this happen under the Biden administration, it's 50, and then the tie can be broken by the vice president. Mm-hmm. So really all you need is 50. So most of those appointments should get through unless they've got some significant baggage with them, either to one individual, but you tend to see a lot more of that disagreement occurring on the House side.
Sean, based on this election, we've also seen some other areas of, of our politics get impacted, and that happened to be kind of in the court side of things. What kind of shifting? Lots of chatter going on right now in that space.
Yeah, obviously with control of the Senate and Donald Trump coming back into the presidency, you do have control of the future of the Supreme Court and other court officials across the country in federal courts. And so the potential for a justice or two to resign potentially makes this court even more conservative. And so while in many ways that could create a favorable environment from a regulatory standpoint, from favoring businesses and the ability to operate, I do think it probably lends itself to more litigation and more fighting at the state level. We saw this happen during the previous Trump administration, where when states don't agree with the federal administration, they take it upon themselves. California is a shining example of that, right. But there are a number of others that were already moving rapidly because they didn't feel like the federal government was acting the way they believed they needed to from a policy standpoint. With Trump going back into the White House and his political appointees and a conservative court possibly getting more conservative sometime in the next 4 years, I think you will see a number of states really go the opposite direction in terms of their state policy. And so litigation will ramp up. Somebody will benefit. Will probably be the trial lawyers.
Right. Somebody
will benefit greatly from that. But at the federal level, I think the potential is out there to see an even more conservative court.
Wow. And right now, you listening to traditional media, they're talking about maybe some of the Democrats would encourage some of these folks to step aside from the Supreme Court right now based on some age and so forth. But, boy, the likelihood of that happening and the likelihood of getting somebody in there before
Correct.
Trump takes the House.
There's a lot of effort being made right now to get some things done before the new Congress comes in. I think it's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And I think the next 2 years, right? Because generally there's a referendum and the midterms tend to go against the sitting president. Mm-hmm. And so depending on what happens over the next 2 years, it's possible that if Republicans do win the House, it flips back to Democratic control. But I think the Democrats are going to do a lot of soul searching right now and look at, okay, how do we get back? Damage control, how do we just kind of limit the damage over the next 2 years? Because they know that they're in for it from a policy standpoint, from a executive agency, judicial system. They know at the federal level they are not going to get anything they want for the next 2 years.
Sure.
And so do you refocus your efforts at the state level, spend a lot of your money at the state level and pursuing those types of things and force the government's hand? But if I'm a Democrat right now, You're really doing a lot of introspective kind of a look at, okay, who is our party? What do we need to do to get back to the middle because we got it wrong?
Right. Yeah. The people have spoke broadly. And, I think there's a lot of folks that may traditionally, and, they all talk about it on the media today, have typically vote one way. But, boy, there's one or two little areas that you can't be a one-subject voter these days.
No. And that'll be, one of the things that we'll see. And I don't know how deep we want to get into it, but one of the interesting things is Robert Kennedy Jr. has played a massive role in getting Donald Trump elected. That's my personal opinion, but I think that if you look out there and you kind of look at some of the narratives that have been issued and you listen to the feedback from some of the voters, a Democrat, former Democrat, put his name and ran and remained on the ticket in many states, but put his endorsement behind Donald Trump and became a surrogate. And he's got a different view on many things, but specific to agriculture, he's got a very different view on agriculture. He's got a different view on the medical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, and the environment and modern agriculture. And so the role that he may play in looking at policy for the next 4 years and the impact that has on us, while many of the things that we've talked about so far have been reasons for optimism, there is uncertainty out there amongst the industry of the sound bites that have come out. You've seen President Trump go on the Joe Rogan podcast and talk about pesticides and some of the information that Robert Kennedy has shared with him. And so there is a level of uncertainty of, okay, well, what priorities will this administration have with regard to many of the tools that we're struggling to keep on the shelves already?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great point. It's no secret the majority of the ag industry kind of voted one way. Looks like they're kind of getting what they asked for. But what I'm hearing you say is caution. There are some little areas that could raise some concerns yet post-election.
Yeah. Mr. Kennedy, I don't know. We talked about the confirmation process. I don't know that he could get through a Senate confirmation. Being a long-term Democrat, and a lot of things that he worked on are not really in line with what the Republican Party stands for. Mm-hmm. A little bit more in line with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump really isn't a political party, right? He's his own party. But so I think that Kennedy would have a hard time getting through the Senate confirmation process. But what you may see him do is appoint him as a special advisor who really has oversight of Health and Human Services, or FDA or USDA or EPA, and reports directly to Trump, but really doesn't have accountability, which is really nerve-wracking if his policy initiatives go the opposite way. But he has spoken out against pesticides and getting pesticides out of the food supply. He's spoken out against a lot of innovative stuff in the medical industry, pharmaceuticals, vaccines. And so, from a science-based standpoint, we are already fighting this battle of you need to follow the science, right, and we need to trust the approvals process that we do with research and through the EPA or FDA. And that battle could get worse, and it could be coming from a different flank. And we may find ourselves fighting a war on pesticides from a flank on the other side. And any history major or history student will tell you that when you start fighting wars on multiple sides, it generally doesn't end up good.
Right. Yeah. It definitely could be a very interesting appointment potentially, or at least an advisor role of
Correct.
some role. Yeah. Sean, other areas kind of somewhat related to this space. We talked earlier about some of the agency appointments, but, some of the policies that these agencies have been, talking about, endangered species, for example, that's not going away.
No, it's not. Certainly the quickest way to change some of what the previous administration has done, you can go through a reversal process. It's a little tricky, but there are ways to undo some of the stuff that hasn't been finalized yet. Another way you can do it is you can pull the funding. So the program exists. You can just not appropriate the funds. With endangered species, the impetus behind it was understanding that the agencies had not done the consultations that they were legally obligated to do so. And so they have shifted, and now they are doing that. And I do not think that it's in anyone's best interest to go away from that. or pull even more funding from the EPA. We've talked on previous shows about reducing funding the EPA actually hurts us,
right?
Because it limits our ability to get new products approved, to get new formulations or improved formulations approved in short order, or find new suppliers. We can't do any of that because there's nobody there. So pulling funding from the EPA isn't the answer, but it's up to this administration as to how they choose to enforce it. When we look at trade, Trump has gone on the record with significantly high tariff proposals. That policy was put in place under his previous administration. The Biden administration really kept many of those tariffs in place, but we've seen China go to other parts of the globe and secure soybeans and look for other grains, look for other consumer markets. And for the United States, it's really a tough spot to be in because we need China as a consumer. We need them to buy many of the goods that we produce, especially on the ag side. Mm-hmm. That was the reason for leveraging the tariffs in the first place was, hey, China, live up to your end of the deal. But 60% tariffs, or higher across the board, what that does to the economy right now, if China agrees and says, okay, we need this, we can't afford to have you cut us off, and they start buying in mass again, it works.
Right.
If it doesn't, in a down ag economy, the situation gets more bleak. And so going back to that uncertainty, that is where I think farmers trust Trump on the whole. They believe that if tariffs are the way to get China to buy, they will walk that line and deal with the short-term heartache as long as it works in the end. But from Helena's standpoint, yeah, you're certainly looking at the future and going, okay, well 60% tariffs, 70% tariffs on everything. We know that it's tough times right now. What does that mean? Especially if we have parts of the country that don't have a bumper crop or markets are depressed.
Definitely a lot still happening here, and this new election, this recent election, is going to impact agriculture and the folks that are involved in it. Thanks, Sean.
I appreciate the time as always.
And welcome back to FieldLink. We've got Jody Lawrence joining us from Nashville. Jody, we've had a huge news week here the last week to 10 days, but we certainly want to welcome you to the FieldLink at this time to talk about some of those big happenings in the news market.
Well, it's great to be back, Bill. You're right. Since the last podcast we've in between the election and the WASDE report, the updates, and just the other normal things going on in the market, it's been a very active November for sure.
Definitely a lot of headlines, and start things off. We'll talk about the elections in a little bit, but boy, let's talk about first things first. The WASDE report that just came out. That's something going to certainly impact growers instantly here. What did that report have to say?
Last Friday on the 8th, the USDA and WASDE came out and updated U.S. bean yield, and then how it trickles down through all the columns through the domestic and world stocks. And surprisingly, the yield was lowered in both corn and beans, which was unexpected because normally the November report is just kind of a temporary landing spot before we get to the January final numbers because there's not one in December. But the USDA did find that the corn crop, not quite as big as they expected. It came in at 183.1. Still a record, still fantastic. So congratulations to everybody that had a big hand in that. And bean yield came in at 51.7. And that's really where the big surprise was because that yield was down almost 2% at 1.1 bushels per acre. But what they found in the yield reductions were that Illinois and Iowa both saw reductions in corn and bean yield. So that's where you start talking about those two big states. And even if they just lose, an eighth or, one full bushel from the previous, that works its way through because that's such a big percentage of the national crop. But at 183.1 and 51.7, still big crops, still great yields for everybody. The corn stalks, and the bean stalks, what you really have to look at on both of those, they're significantly larger than last year. And with no issues going on in South America. They got their monsoon season started a little bit late, but they have caught up on planting. Everything looks great. They're getting plenty of rain. They're on their way for both Argentina and Brazil, assuming Argentina doesn't run into the leafhopper corn stunt problem again, on their way to at least trend, if not record yields at this point. So you've got plenty of corn and beans in the world, both. But the nice thing was that the USDA trimmed them, and in between the cut in yield and then kind of a knee-jerk late reaction to the election, you had beans trading this morning almost a full 70 cents off the Tuesday night lows, which welcome for everybody, because this was with corn, up about 25 cents off those lows. Another bite at the apple to sell some bushels that we just didn't expect when we were sitting on election night, when it became obvious that Trump was going to win.
Right. Yeah. Definitely some interesting news there, and a great opportunity for producers to really take some action if they're in the right spot with those kind of bushel, basically really with that report.
And yeah, because you just don't, even though we always expect to get some sort of post-harvest rally, and both of them in this afternoon's report, they may not even report it. It's so far along because they're both past 95%. But everybody except the people who either had a weather issue or had a mechanical issue have finished and have shut down their bins, trying to figure out what their cash flow, when to sell a little more to balance the books for 24 and what to push into 25. So you always expect some sort of positive seasonal rally this time of year, but when WASDE gets in and helps you, that's a real bonus. And, a 70-cent rally in a market, now stay on beans, a 70-cent rally in beans in a year where we doubled the domestic carryover, that's something you just have. You can't go, gosh, I'm sure it's going higher. You just go, thank you very much, and you clear some chips off the table by selling some bushels.
Right.
And the same with corn.
A good opportunity to take advantage of that little uptick there for sure. Speaking about upticks and, opportunities, let's talk about fuel, Jody. We've seen some movement in that industry.
Yeah, since the election, and this really is about policy, and this, now that Trump and how he may govern with, the apparent sweep of the House and Senate and the Oval Office, he's got more leverage certainly than he did the first time. And the first time, a businessman coming into the office, the markets had no clue what to expect. And now, with one term under our belts to kind of see, he is much more of a known factor. Not that he still doesn't have those wild card tendencies, but we certainly have got an idea where he's going. And early promises are that he is going to be talking quickly with Israel, Palestine, Hamas, and Iran to get that over. And that certainly impacts Middle East peace, and Middle East peace means lower oil prices. And he is also very pro drilling and more production domestically, which also puts pressure on prices. So I'm still wanting to hedge breaks because the world's too much of an uncertain place. And when you look at crude oil domestically in the United States, break even typically runs about $58 to $62 a barrel, and we're sitting at 68 right now. So not that it can certainly go lower, but we know it can go higher. We'll see. Another interest rate cut came out last week that we didn't even mention in all the news, but an economy that is apparently coming in for a very soft landing. Good potential. So, keep hedging on any breaks. And if you see $62 crude, I'd certainly be topping off your diesel and unleaded tanks.
Jody, we talked a little bit about, you touched on it a little bit, the election, which captured a tremendous amount of news. And it is amazing how big things like interest rate just kind of got pushed to the side, obviously because of all the news stuff with the election and Trump taking the presidency. And apparently, like you just said, certainly got the Senate locked up, and court still out a little bit on the House, but looking like it's going to go all directions for the Republican Party. Jody, how is that? Basically, how's the soybean or how's the fuel market responded to all of this?
Well, this has been the most interesting kind of unexpected, I guess, law of unintended consequences is what I would call it since the election, because all of the chatter going into the election, and you could see it almost daily whenever a piece came out about the Trump tariff before a month ago, before when the election we still thought was hotly contested, that the tariffs would absolutely kill U.S. export sales, especially in beans to China, and that it would have a major negative impact and also embolden Brazil just to continue to expand to be China's provider. But an interesting thing happened Tuesday night. I was up probably about 1 o'clock in the morning when it became obvious that Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania was certainly tending that way, that it was going to go to Trump. The bean market was down, 20, 25 cents. It was at a point where it was testing the contract lows on the logic that he's going to come in, he's going to start another trade war with China. We're going to have these big tariffs, and beans are going to be worse for the wear from that policy. But then beans started rallying a little bit, and the logic changed that when he started talking about energy policy, because he is not abandoning all of the biorenewable stuff, it became obvious that the biggest problem for U.S. soybean demand had been this flood of used cooking oil from China over the last 18 months that had killed the domestic bean oil demand. So all these new crush facilities were sitting on all these stockpiles of bean oil that was supposed to be processed and used for renewable diesel and used for sustainable aviation fuel, but was getting pushed out because everybody could get the used cooking oil cheap from China and get the tax credits, waiting on 45Z to pass through the Treasury Department. But then the trade just kind of realized, hey, those tariffs are also going to apply to all this used cooking oil. And And his policy, trade war or tariffs, will probably end that problem, although 45Z certainly still needs to be passed into law to make it official. But if we end the used cooking oil imports, that changes the whole dynamic. And you have seen bean oil rally almost 15% since kind of that realization set into the market. And while it is unusual for a bean oil rally to lead beans into a bullish phase, this is certainly a great first step, because this goes back to what we talked about before the used cooking oil became a problem, that SAF could become the bean equivalent of what ethanol is for corn. And if this comes about faster than we expected because of the tariffs and SAF and the expansion in 2025, then all of a sudden, the tariffs look like the greatest thing in the world if you're growing soybeans and you're delivering to a crush facility.
And I think what's interesting about that whole subject matter is traditional thinking was, oh my gosh, looking at some of the Trump tariffs going into the election was, as you mentioned, Jody, oh my gosh, this is going to impact agriculture significantly. But what we failed to look at, I guess, in this case, was all of the innovation and technology and what it was intended to do, right? SAF was really intended for soybean producers to come up with new technology, new innovation to fuel, the world's airlines.
Absolutely. And this is what is fascinating moving forward. And not that all of a sudden we think none of us are naive enough to think, oh, well, Trump learned his lesson. He's going to be a kinder, gentler version of Donald Trump in his second administration. There's still going to be volatility, and there's still going to be some head scratching on why in the world did he say or do that. But we at least have some sort of a roadmap, and the immediate roadmap right now, as far as ag is concerned, is that if the SAF is allowed to take off and the used cooking oil imports stop, the beans go up corn goes up, it'll help everything across the board, which, like you said, the conventional wisdom going into this was, man, another trade war and another tariff. This,
Right.
you know, when are we going to see $2 corn and $7 beans? And I love the chaos theory. I'm a big proponent of it. And honestly, this is something I didn't see in any print or anything a month ago, or anybody even talk about, until it was kind of like, oh, look, what's happening right in front of us, exactly
Right.
the opposite of what we thought.
Yeah. That's what keeps things, I guess, kind of interesting. And I think we have a whole lot of, well, we're probably going to have 4 more years of interesting as it relates to that area, for sure. But Jody, you know, as you're talking to some of your colleagues across the country and really internationally, what's been the general feedback post-election?
Well, you know, and this, I'm not going to get on my political soapbox here, but clearly rural America is who listens to our podcast, and where we, where we visit and where we work and what we do. They showed up for Trump, and it made an enormous difference in the election. And so everybody I've talked to is happy about the election, with a lot of optimism, because I talked to several farmers go, okay, now that all this uncertainty is clear, I'm ready to buy a new piece of equipment. I am ready to invest in doing this in my operation. Even though their margins are small, they have a confidence going forward with a Republican House, Senate, and Oval Office that they just didn't have a week ago.
Well, interesting times are certainly ahead of us and across the country, and certainly at Capitol Hill, as the elections are pretty well finalized, as Donald Trump will become our next president of the United States, and he'll be armed with a strong Senate, as well as possibly a Congress to back up his agenda. Jody, want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink, and have a great day.
Well, thank you, Bill. And we're recording this on Monday, Veterans Day. I want to thank all the veterans who listen to this. It'll be a little bit late when you hear it, but we appreciate your service. We appreciate your family's sacrifice for all these great things that we have in our country.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, Jody.
Thank you, Bill.
This episode of FieldLink has been brought to you by Resurge. Put life back into your soil with Resurge. Contact your Helena representative to learn more. Be sure to subscribe to the FieldLink podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode.